The impetus for writing the piece was an incident which happened last week in Khayelitsha, which is a township on the so-called outskirts of the city of Cape Town. And what happened was there was a community of residents occupying a piece of land. And the official story goes, according to the city of Cape Town, they were occupying the piece of land unlawfully, and there was an eviction order that the city of Cape Town obtained, which empowered them to evict those residents. And one of those residents was a man by the name of Bulelani Kolani. And over the course of this eviction, which had included other residents, his eviction happened. His eviction from his home happened while he was naked and wasn't wearing any clothes, and he was violently dragged from outside of his shack, which is, for people who don't understand what that word means, basically a makeshift structure that tries to serve as a home for people out of materials such as corrugated iron, wood, wire, and other materials. So he was violently dragged out of his shack by these law enforcement officers, and what happens afterwards is he's desperately trying to get back into his home because he's naked, and the law enforcement officers try to restrain him. And he manages to very briefly successfully get back inside his shack, after which the people who are responsible for carrying out the eviction proceed to demolish his home after this entire episode. So it's a very difficult video to watch, and it's a video that I think correctly sparked a lot of outrage and uproar, and was widely circulated on social media and inspired responses from a lot of South Africans. And so what's happened over the last few days is various different groups in society trying to sort of control the narrative of how we should understand this eviction. On the one hand, we have the city of Cape Town, which is governed by the Democratic Alliance. The Democratic Alliance is South Africa's official opposition, and they're the only political party that has provincial power. They govern the Western Cape as well. So we have the Democratic Alliance, whose reputation over the years has suffered due to them being notorious for carrying these evictions out in many communities, and particularly doing so in a heartless manner. And one of the reasons why the nature of the evictions carried out by the Democratic Alliance are especially upsetting and especially sort of, I guess, worthy of outrage is that Cape Town is a South African city that has a particularly bad legacy of spatial apartheid. So the city's inequality is perfectly mapped geographically, where you have wealthy suburban areas in which mostly white South Africans live, and poor and disadvantaged areas in which mostly Black and colored South Africans live. So the city of Cape Town tried to control this narrative. They've tried to say that it was a legal eviction order that they've obtained, and the mayor of Cape Town, Dan Plato, has gone so far as to say that Mr. Kolani even deliberately undressed himself in order to embarrass the city over the course of this eviction. And so the DA is trying to control the narrative to exonerate itself from any blame and to defend its actions. And at the same time, the ruling party, the African National Congress, has sort of weaponized this moment to try and portray the Democratic Alliance as being an especially anti-poor administration, an administration that runs contrary to the interests of the majority of South Africans. Becky Cele, for example, who is the current South African Minister of Police, made a personal visit to Mr. Kolani, and has even made statements saying he'll fast track the assault charges which have been lodged against the 4 law enforcement officers who are responsible for this eviction. And effectively then, my piece kind of looks at all of what is happening and tries to make sense of this episode and how people are currently unpacking this eviction episode. And effectively the argument that I try to make is to say that there's nothing new about this eviction. First and foremost, this eviction, or evictions rather, in South Africa, evictions are carried out by both the Democratic Alliance as well as the African National Congress. And the way both political parties understand evictions is always to portray the people who are occupying land as being people who are invading that land, which is to say that they have no claim to that land. That land rightfully belongs to the city, and the interests of the city and people who are seeking housing and shelter are antagonistic, is how they understand it to be. As well as to say that when it comes to understanding evictions in South Africa, we should understand evictions and dispossession generally as being a foundational aspect of South Africa's political economy as it's unfolded throughout history. So it's an integral part of the development of South African capitalism. It's intimately linked to our apartheid and colonial past. And it's something that we shouldn't object to only if it's carried out in a particularly egregiously inhumane way, as Mr. Xolani's eviction was. But it's something that we should object to court, because people are being deprived of a home and shelter. And what that deprivation of a home and shelter, I think, represents in the South African context is that denial of citizenship, is expelling people to the margins of society in order to make the general exploitation that exists in that society much more feasible, if the lines of inclusion and exclusion can be made explicit. And the eviction is one way in which the lines of inclusion and exclusion are made explicit. And yeah,
I mean, yeah, I was going to ask, just sort of, Saeed, we know that in Lagos, right, there's a sort of similar process where people, it's called Tarkwa Bay. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because this is a nice way for us to then move on to Nigeria. But there's been similar processes there. And there was also violence. I remember the scenes of violence when they were also dragging people out of their homes for that. Yeah. And that's ongoing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, yeah. So, I mean, first of all, yeah, great piece, Will. And the incident you're referencing, Sean, in a community called Tarkwa Bay, and a community near Tarkwa Bay called Okunayo, actually happened in January of this year. And what happened was, basically early in the morning, naval officials of the Nigerian Navy showed up to these communities and were firing gunshots in the air, and told residents of these communities that they had about an hour to pack up all of their belongings and leave immediately. And actually, similar to what Will has described in South Africa, I mean, these are fairly sort of common, unfortunately, scenarios in Lagos. So over the course of the past decade, there have been numerous such evictions playing out in similarly quite picturesque, waterfront communities. You can see the picture of Tarkwa Bay over there, and it's quite a lovely place. But also in various other areas that kind of were marked as sites for redevelopment of various sorts. So in the Nigerian case, what we're witnessing is a similar process whereby, sort of poor, kind of semi-informal dwellers are effectively dispossessed to make room for kind of luxury developments of various sort, or malls, or kind of various sorts of larger scale, kind of more elite focused projects. So it's a trend that unfortunately seems to be kind of accelerating here as pressures over land rights and kind of sort of availability of land increases. But as Will has pointed out, I think it clearly also illustrates the question of who the state thinks it's here to protect, whose interest the state thinks it's here to guard. And it's clearly not the interest of these folks who were given an hour to basically uproot the lives that they have built over the course of decades of living in this community. And I mean, there was some pretty facile explanations offered by the state for the evictions. I mean, there was some reference to oil bunkering, which, because this particular community is situated on the site of a major pipeline, there was some criminal activity that went on vis-a-vis the pipeline, but that in no way can justify, and in fact, kind of even from the perspective of the law, does not amount to or grant sanction to this sort of blanket punishment. So yeah, I mean, it was a very tragic moment, and the communities that were displaced basically have been more or less scattered to the winds. There's one or two settlements that have sprung up in other areas where kind of host communities have been generous enough to grant some space for some informal housing. But that this would happen, in a city where there's already a quite dramatic amount of housing shortages, and that this has actually continued to happen even into the period of the COVID-19 lockdown, just illustrates again, the point that Will makes of a state who sees its role as protecting the interests of a certain class against that of people who it considers disposable or to be encroaching on lands that it considers valuable. So unfortunately, just this sort of classic process of accumulation by dispossession.